Ancient biblical prophets wrote about the future. Today, theologians are poring over those scriptures with a firm belief that their prophecies are coming to pass. Journey now into the world of eschatology on Prophecy in the News with author and lecturer J.R. Church.
There are at least three groups who want the Temple Mount in Jerusalem: the Palestinians, the Israelis, and the Knights Templar. I have in my hand the Sunday Post from Glasgow, Scotland, that tells about the death of a Knight Templar. His name, Alisdair Rosslyn Sinclair. He died while in police custody, mysteriously, and when his body was returned for burial, his heart had been removed from his body. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the death of a Knight Templar.
And J.R., this is maybe one of the greatest contemporary mysteries you can possibly imagine. It's full of intrigue, espionage, undercover work of all kinds, plotting and planning. The center of it is the Temple Mount. And I'm looking at Daniel chapter 11, which goes through some of the monarchies, starting with Persia, with Greece, Alexander the Great, and then his four generals who divided his empire, the Ptolemies, then the Seleucids. Out of the Seleucid dynasty came Antiochus Epiphanes, and then you turn the page, and as you follow this bloodline, you come down to what Daniel calls the willful king. The king shall do according to his own will. That's verse 36. And then by the time you get to verse 45, this is the willful king, shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Now that's Mount Zion. That's downtown Jerusalem. That's the Temple Mount. It's the hottest piece of real estate on planet Earth today. And the strange murder mystery that J.R. just told you about from the Sunday Post has everything to do with this prophecy of Daniel.
Let's talk about the Knights Templar for a few moments, because they figure into this quest for the Temple Mount and the Ark of the Covenant. Gary, let's go back just a little bit for the history to bring everybody up to speed. It was in 1099 that Godfrey de Bouillon, a Merovingian, went to Israel with 5 armies from 5 cousin kings and established the Crusader kingdom. He drove the Muslim infidels out of Jerusalem and set up the kingdom. Well, he died the next year in 1100, but his brother Baldwin took over the throne. And 19 years after the taking of Jerusalem, that is in 1118, Hughes de Payen shows up on King Baldwin's doorstep in Jerusalem with 8 of his friends, and they called themselves the Knights of the Temple. And their stated purpose was to simply keep the roadways and the highways safe for pilgrims coming to Jerusalem. But the Knights Templar, who, by the way, were housed in the palace of King Baldwin for the next few years, in 1127 went back home to Europe, wealthy beyond all imagination. And they became the international banking cartel, literally have bought the world. And the Knights Templars are the ones behind the quest for Jerusalem to be turned over to the United Nations.
Yeah, J.R., and the interesting thing about this is that when they came back with great wealth, it's rumored that they may well have discovered at least some part of the ancient temple treasure, which was buried in the environs of the Temple Mount. And not only that, but they found some of the buried holy scrolls. And they, of course, treasured these greatly, brought them back to Europe, and there they resided in great wealth. In fact, they were the cathedral builders of Europe, and they were the ones who were great builders, particularly builders in stone.
Yeah, stonemasons.
Stonemasons.
Now, you know, it's interesting, Gary, that the architecture of the Gothic structures of the churches flourished under the Knights Templars during those years following their return to Europe. So it is thought by some that they found the very plans for Solomon's temple and used that architectural type to become the architecture of the cathedrals of Europe.
It's an amazing story that winds down through the centuries. Well, as we continue with the story, moving up to the 12th, 13th centuries, they became extremely influential in Europe, to the point that you might well call them the kingmakers.
They had so much gold that they devised a plan by which they could transfer gold from one city to another without actually transferring the gold. They wrote down the amounts on pieces of paper, which they called checks, and so they invented the modern check writing. And Gary, it's interesting that these Knights Templars had a castle in Paris, and France, of course, was their main headquarters at the time of 1307, when the Pope, Clement V, and his friend, the King of France, issued a papal bull against the Knights Templar and began to arrest them. In 1307, they were arrested, and a few years later, Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny, who both headed up the Knights Templars, were burned at the stake.
That's right.
And of course, the Knights Templar scattered all over Europe. It was in 1314 that the papal bull was issued outlawing the Knights Templars throughout all of Europe.
Yeah, the papal bull followed the midnight arrests. In 1307, there was a secret order that went out from the Vatican to get rid of all these men. They're just too powerful. And it is said that 15,000 of them were arrested in one night. They were imprisoned in the most horrible conditions. They were tortured. There were inquisitions. And as J.R. said, Jacques de Molay, Geoffrey de Charny were killed. They became sort of the heroes of that movement. And the Knights Templar group went underground at that point, and that's where our story gets interesting.
Yes. Now, one group went down into Spain and to Portugal, and of course from them comes the famous story of Columbus and his Knight Templar cross on the Santa Maria. But another group went north into Scotland, and they were given sanctuary at the Rosslyn Castle. I suppose that was the king's castle.
Well, as a matter of fact, J.R., as the story goes, there was a small castle there, but the St. Clair family at that time took this small edifice, and upon the grounds, they decided to do it upright, just the way it was done back in Europe. And they built the huge edifice known as Rosslyn Castle, which, by the way, is there to this day. It's an amazing tourist attraction. And the Rosslyn Castle is full of the most mystery and intrigue you can possibly imagine. Now, we're talking about the gentleman who died in Israel. His name was Alisdair Rosslyn Sinclair.
Yes.
And the mystery of why his body came back without its heart deepens.
Yes. Now, the interesting thing is there are rumors that the treasure of the Knights Templars buried under the Rosslyn Castle in some of the underground tunnels and under the Rosslyn Chapel on the grounds of the Rosslyn Castle is said to be the hiding place of the Holy Grail. So you can see it really gets interesting. Now, the Rosslyn Institute has given us Dolly the sheep.
That's right.
And the pigs with human DNA.
That's correct.
And so we've got some weird, strange, spooky stuff going on at the Rosslyn Institute.
If there is a spooky place on planet Earth, it's got to be Rosslyn Castle, which is on the outskirts of Edinburgh, Scotland. And J.R., Alisdair Rosslyn Sinclair went to Israel on quote-unquote business in 1998, and it was there that all this intrigue came to a head. And by the way, I should mention before we continue, it's said that those scrolls that were secreted beneath the temple site in Jerusalem actually were brought back and to this day are housed in secret chambers beneath Rosslyn Castle.
Yes. Now, the interesting thing about his death is that when his body was brought back, it was found not to have a heart. There is a reason why his heart was removed. And it takes us back to 1307 to 1314 and the rule of King Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland. Let me just hasten to say that Bill Clinton claims descent from the Scottish kings.
He does indeed.
In fact, Robert the Bruce, builder, I guess, of the Rosslyn Castle, was actually the one who took all the fiefdoms or fiefdoms and put them together and made it a country called Scotland.
That's right.
There's a lot more to this story, so stay tuned. We'll be back in just a moment. I'm holding in my hand the Sunday Post from Glasgow, Scotland. The headline, Scot in Ritual Death Mystery. Knight Templar linked to missing heart. A Scots tourist who mysteriously died in Israel may have been murdered because of his involvement in a shadowy organization which dates back to Robert the Bruce and the Crusades. It's also now believed that Alisdair Rosslyn Sinclair had his heart removed as part of a bizarre medieval ritual after his death. Gary, what about the Knights Templar?
Robert the Bruce, at the time when Pope Clement V issued the famous papal bull ordering the arrests of all the Templars throughout Christendom in Europe, November of 1307 is when that happened. Scotland was at that time locked in a fierce struggle with England and trying to preserve its national independence. Well, leading the struggle of the Scots was the famed King Robert the Bruce, who at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 crushed the British, and to such an extent, by the way, that Scotland became a viable country for the first time, and England was defeated, so that for several centuries to come, Scotland was unchallenged. And now, it's interesting that Robert the Bruce is the man who founded all of the activities that we see around Rosslyn Castle. And I'm reading here from the article in the Sunday Post, the Knights Templar, and I'm quoting, believe they're the rightful heirs to the Christian holy sites in Jerusalem and are currently involved in a secret battle to gain control of them. And I'm still quoting, Alisdair was killed because he got caught up in this clandestine war. The removal of his heart is part of the Knights Templar tradition. When Robert the Bruce died, he asked that his heart be cut out and taken from Scotland to be buried in Jerusalem. In Israel, legend has it that all of his dying wishes were fulfilled. End quote. Now, JR, this is an amazing thing. This shows you to the extent to which these men feel a connection to the Temple Mount. They have not given up to this day.
He may have been buried in Scotland, but his heart was buried in Israel, in Jerusalem, near the Temple Mount. Well, you know, this is a tradition that flourished in England. In fact, it was many of the ancient Knights Templar who died on foreign shores, their hearts were cut out and brought back to England.
Yes.
So even though they died on a foreign shore, their heart was buried in England. In fact, the famous missionary, Dr. Livingstone, when he was dying in Africa, asked that his heart be removed from his body and buried in Africa, though his body itself was taken back and buried in Westminster Cathedral with great pomp and ceremony. But his heart remained in Africa. That's where his work was. Yeah. And so you see, all of this dates back to Robert the Bruce. Now here we have a Knight Templar, direct descendant of the Order of Knights out of Rosslyn Castle in Edinburgh, Scotland, dying while in police custody. The first thing I ask is, why was he in police custody? Well, the Israeli police say that he was dealing in a drug called ecstasy, but there was no proof of that. It's trumped up charges, probably. And it was also said that he hung himself with his shoestrings, if you believe that. Now, another interesting thing is, when the body was brought back, Gary, I think the cartilage in his neck was missing also, wasn't it?
Also missing from the body was the cartilage in his neck, JR.
Why?
And it is said by those who deal in forensic medicine that you cannot affirm that a body was hanged if you remove certain cartilage from the neck. Therefore, it obliterated his maybe so and maybe not suicide. The whole thing looks like a cover-up in a big way. And his brother, James Sinclair, has been quoted, and by the way, in this article and in other places, as saying that he was on business that had directly to do with the Temple Mount. You know, I read a quote here. from the Sinclair family, we're very much concerned about what's going on in Jerusalem, and particularly area around the Old City, which includes the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Dome of the Rock, Solomon's Temple. We believe these holy sites should not be left in the hands of the Israeli government, who are denying Christians proper access to them. We would like to see the UN assume control of this important place, that is the Temple Mount, and we are working hard to achieve this goal, end quote. Now, J.R., that is Bible prophecy to a T.
Yes, it is. Years ago, back in the 1989, in fact, I published a book entitled Guardians of the Grail and the Men Who Planned to Rule the World, which gives the story of the Knights Templars and their descendants down to this very day, and their continuing quest for the Temple Mount and Jerusalem to become an internationalized city. A spokesman for the Scottish Knights Templar admitted to the Sunday Post, and I quote, "We are currently involved in an attempt to remove control of the holy sites of Jerusalem from the Israeli government. We believe they should be administered by the United Nations and are working with the UN and NATO to achieve that goal." Gary, it looks like the United Nations is actually a Knight Templar organization.
Or working in very close affiliation with same, and it also looks like the Israeli Mossad is well aware of that fact. Taking us back to Daniel 11:45, where we started out, here we have a Seleucid relative, many generations removed from Antiochus. And in Daniel 11:45 it says, "He shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain." Now, J.R., if the Antichrist government is an international government, as we believe it to be,
sponsored by the UN,
sponsored by the United Nations, then Daniel 11:45 is in view when we talk about all this intrigue with the Sinclair family.
So why would his heart be removed? We don't know. We'll never know the rest of the story until we get to heaven. We can only speculate. But since he was in Israeli hands, Gary, I suggest the possibility that the Israeli government wanted to send a message to the Knights Templar to bug off, to leave Jerusalem to the Israelis.
Well, it's kind of fascinating that there's an Israeli author who's written, in the process of writing a book about this. He has just finished a book called Who Murdered Yitzhak Rabin. His name is Barry Chumash.
Which we don't offer, by the way, through this ministry.
Right.
You'd have to get it through a bookstore.
Right, yes, but we do mention it because it chronicles some of the intrigue that's currently taking place in Israel. And in his book, he reveals that Alisdair Rosslyn Sinclair, and I'm quoting, is a descendant of one of the original Knights Templar on business in order to set up by a French relative of the St. Clair family of Rosslyn an official presence at the Temple Mount. In other words, author Barry Chumash believes that Alisdair was on official business relative to the Temple Mount, that he encountered the Mossad, he was taken into custody, and that he was probably questioned, quote unquote, rather severely.
Now, back up to the day when Bill Clinton became President of the United States 8 years ago. 1992, actually, I guess. And he began feverishly to work for a peace treaty.
Yes.
This descendant of the Scottish kings. Isn't that amazing?
It's totally amazing.
Yeah, this descendant of the Scottish kings, by September of 1993, had brought the two warring factions of Palestinians and Israelis together on the White House lawn to sign a peace accord. And ever since then, there have been eruption after eruption after eruption, brought them to Camp David in the summer of the year 2000 to try to hammer out a final peace accord, suggested that they turn the Temple Mount over to the United Nations. Both the Palestinians and the Israelis balked at that, rejected the notion. The UN met in September of the year 2000 to declare world governance and to be accepted by putting the signature on the dotted line of 150 kings, queens, presidents, prime ministers, heads of state from all over the world, who are in agreement with this coming world government.
And James Sinclair, Alisdair Rosslyn Sinclair's brother, along with Barry Chumish, believes, and I'm quoting, "I believe," he says, "Alisdair was trying to escape from Israel when he was killed. The Knights Templar are not welcomed by the authorities and other organizations here, that is in Israel." End quote, James Sinclair.
Yes. Is it possible that Bill Clinton was not really trying to get the two warring factions together, but using the old military adage of divide and conquer, he's the one who really wants the Temple Mount? He and the United Nations? Well, there's a lot more to this story that we cannot tell you because we simply don't know. It's a secret organization, and who knows what goes on in those smoke-filled conference rooms, you know. We'll not know till we get to heaven, but boy, I'm sure glad I'm a Christian. I'm anxious to get there and find out the rest of the story. We'll be back in just a moment.